I have watched men cling to titles long after power has evaporated, and I have learned that the most dangerous fiction in international affairs is the belief that declaring yourself something makes it so. Intelligence officers are trained to separate symbols from control, recognition from authority, and rhetoric from capability. Yet, time and again, Washington indulges the opposite impulse, confusing narratives of legitimacy with the hard mechanics of law enforcement and jurisdiction. The question of whether declaring yourself president can still protect you from prison is not theoretical. It is an intelligence problem rooted in how states recognize power and how courts treat it once recognition collapses. In practice, office only confers protection when it is backed by effective control and recognized immunity. Diplomatic status is not self assigned, it is granted by other states and embedded in treaties, customary law, and reciprocal interest. When that recognition erodes, the shield disappears. Intelligence failures begin when analysts assume that a leader's internal narrative, still president, still sovereign, still untouchable, will be honored externally. That assumption is false. Courts do not adjudicate slogans, they adjudicate jurisdiction, custody, and charges. I have seen this miscalculation up close. Former leaders often believe that their past authority freezes time, that the world will continue to treat them as indispensable actors rather than defendants. Intelligence reporting frequently reinforces this delusion by overweighting regime propaganda and underweighting legal exposure. When indictments are filed, arrest warrants issued, and extradition requests prepared, the decisive factor is not self-proclaimed status, but whether any state is willing to enforce the law. Once custody is achieved, the claim of office becomes theater. The strategic consequence is predictable. By the time a courtroom replaces a palace, the intelligence community has already failed if it still frames the individual as a sitting power broker. The analytical breakdown is simple. Immunity is conditional, legitimacy is external, enforcement is operational. Titles without recognition do not travel. They do not stop marshals, judges, or treaties. The hard lesson is that in a world of cooperative law enforcement and politicized but functional courts, declaring yourself president is no longer a shield. It is often the first line of a defense strategy that signals how completely power has already been lost. Recognition is where fantasy dies. Intelligence officers learn early that legitimacy is not self-generated. It is conferred, withdrawn, and traded by states according to interest. A leader can control territory yet lack recognition, or enjoy recognition while losing control. But when recognition collapses completely, legal exposure accelerates. I have watched policymakers misunderstand this distinction for decades, treating recognition as a moral endorsement rather than a practical switch that determines immunity, travel, banking access, and vulnerability to arrest. Once recognition is withdrawn by key states, the individual ceases to function as a protected sovereign actor and begins to exist as a private person with a resume of alleged crimes. From an intelligence perspective, recognition operates like a gatekeeper. While recognized heads of state benefit from diplomatic immunity, inviolability, and the reluctance of foreign courts to intervene. When recognition is rescinded or fractured, those protections erode unevenly but decisively. Prosecutors gain latitude, arrest warrants gain traction, and extradition requests become politically feasible. Analysts who fail to track recognition shifts accurately end up briefing policymakers with outdated assumptions about safety and leverage. I have seen intelligence products continue to refer to the president long after embassies closed, assets were frozen, and allies quietly signaled they would not interfere with detention. The distortion often comes from narrative inertia. Governments hesitate to acknowledge recognition collapse because it implies policy failure. Intelligence assessments then soften language, suggesting ambiguity where none exists. Courts do not share that hesitation. Judges look to statutes, treaties, and executive branch positions. If a government no longer recognizes an individual as head of state, courts treat claims of immunity skeptically. The defendant's insistence on still being president becomes irrelevant unless another sovereign intervenes decisively on his behalf. In most cases, no one does. The strategic consequence of misreading recognition is severe. Leaders who believe they retain immunity continue to travel, communicate openly, and expose themselves operationally. Intelligence services that reinforce this belief contribute to capture rather than prevention. The analytical breakdown is straightforward. Recognition is binary in practice, even if it appears fuzzy in diplomacy. Once key jurisdictions withdraw it, the risk profile flips. Law enforcement replaces intelligence containment as the dominant threat. The hard lesson is uncomfortable for those who mistake politics for protection. Recognition is not a sentiment, it is an operational condition. When it ends, declarations mean nothing. The courtroom does not care who you say you are. It cares who, if anyone, still recognizes you as such. One of the quiet failures of modern intelligence is its tolerance for myth. I am not talking about deception by adversaries. I am talking about the stories we tell ourselves inside the system and then mistake for analysis. The myth that a leader who proclaims continued authority somehow retains protection is one of the most persistent. It survives because it is comfortable. It allows analysts and policymakers to avoid confronting the consequences of recognition, collapse, and legal exposure. Instead of recalibrating risk, they recycle language that implies durability where none exists. This failure usually begins with collection bias. Intelligence reporting often privileges regime-controlled messaging, elite statements, and symbolic acts over measurable indicators of power. Analysts read declarations, speeches, and stage displays and infer resilience. What they neglect are the harder signals: the loss of banking access, the closing of airspace, the quiet cooperation between prosecutors and foreign ministries. When those indicators appear, they are often treated as secondary developments rather than decisive shifts. The myth persists that as long as a leader says he is in charge, some residue of immunity remains. I have reviewed intelligence assessments that continued to describe individuals as functioning heads of state, even after they were unable to travel freely or engage diplomatically. This is not analytical rigor, it is narrative contamination. Once intelligence adopts the subject's self-description, it stops doing its job. Courts, meanwhile, move faster. Prosecutors do not wait for intelligence consensus. They act when jurisdiction aligns, when evidence meets thresholds, and when political obstacles recede. By the time analysts acknowledge the change, the operational window has already closed. The strategic consequence of this myth-making is predictable. It produces surprise at arrest, confusion at arraignment, and frantic reinterpretation after the fact. Policymakers ask how this could happen. The answer is that intelligence failed to strip away narrative and focus on capability and exposure. The analytical breakdown reveals a familiar pattern: symbols over substance, language over law, assumption over verification. Declared authority was treated as a variable. In reality, it had already collapsed to zero. The hard lesson is, one, intelligence professionals should not need to relearn. Self-proclaimed status is not intelligence. It is a data point to be tested and usually discarded. When analysts allow myth to substitute for assessment, they do not just misunderstand the target. They misunderstand the system that will ultimately judge him. And that system does not run on belief. For most of the 20th century, intelligence services treated the removal of leaders as a kinetic or covert problem. Coups, exile, assassination, or negotiated exits were the tools of the trade. What has changed, and what many analysts still refuse to internalize, is that courts have become the primary mechanism for neutralizing former heads of state. This shift did not happen overnight, but it is now mature enough that ignoring it constitutes analytical malpractice. The battlefield has moved from airfields and palaces to courtrooms and detention facilities, and intelligence has been slow to adapt. The transition began as legal architecture accumulated quietly in the background. Universal jurisdiction statutes, expanded conspiracy laws, mutual legal assistance treaties, and the routine use of sealed indictments created an enforcement ecosystem that operates across borders. Intelligence agencies often view this as background noise because it lacks the drama of covert action. That is a mistake. Courts work slowly, but they work relentlessly. Once a case is built and jurisdiction is secured, the outcome becomes procedural rather than political. Declaring yourself president does not interrupt a motion schedule. The intelligence failure here is structural. Analysts are trained to assess military balance and political stability, not prosecutorial momentum. They monitor troop movements more closely than docket filings. As a result, they miss the moment when a target's primary threat shifts from regime change to arrest. I have seen intelligence estimates continue to focus on internal unrest while prosecutors were already coordinating extradition logistics. By the time the individual appears in court, intelligence is left explaining an event it should have anticipated. The strategic consequence is a fundamental reordering of deterrence. Leaders once believed that losing power meant retirement or exile. Now it increasingly means indictment. This changes elite behavior in ways intelligence must account for. Some cling to office longer, not to govern, but to delay prosecution. Others miscalculate, assuming that political relevance equals legal protection. The analytical breakdown shows a mismatch between old models and new realities. Courts do not negotiate in the way intelligence services do. They enforce. The hard lesson is that intelligence must stop treating law as an afterthought. In the current environment, the most decisive operation against a former leader is often a warrant, not a weapon. Those who declare themselves president in the face of charges are not asserting power. They are signaling that they no longer understand where power now resides. When a former leader stands in a courtroom and declares himself still president, he is not making a legal argument. He is conducting narrative warfare. I have seen this tactic repeatedly, and it follows the familiar intelligence logic. If you cannot control events, attempt to control perception. The courtroom becomes a stage, and the declaration of office becomes a signal aimed not at the judge, but at supporters, foreign audiences, and any remaining power brokers who might intervene. From an analytical standpoint, this is not defiance born of strength. It is compensation for the absence of leverage. Intelligence professionals understand narrative operations when adversaries use them against us, yet they often misread them when they originate from individuals once aligned with U.S. interests. The declaration of continued presidency is designed to reframe the proceeding as illegitimate, to imply kidnapping, political persecution, or violation of sovereignty. It seeks to drag the court into a geopolitical argument it is structurally unwilling to have. Judges are not arbiters of recognition or revolution. They are arbiters of jurisdiction and process. Narrative assertions bounce off that reality. The failure comes when intelligence and media analysis treat these declarations as meaningful indicators of future outcomes. They are not. They are indicators of strategy collapse. Once arraigned, the individual's remaining tools are symbolic: language, posture, and grievance. Intelligence reporting that amplifies these claims without context feeds confusion. I have seen assessments speculate about diplomatic fallout triggered by courtroom rhetoric, only for nothing to materialize. The reason is simple. Narrative warfare without state backing has no enforcement mechanism. The strategic consequence of this misreading is misplaced expectation. Supporters are led to believe that legal proceedings can be disrupted by political claims. Policymakers worry about escalation that never comes. Meanwhile, the legal process advances quietly, deadlines are set, evidence exchanged, and options narrow. The analytical breakdown reveals that the declaration of office serves one primary function: to preserve self-identity in the face of irreversible loss. It is psychological and performative, not operational. The hard lesson is one intelligence officers should recognize instantly. When a man in custody insists he is still president, he is not shaping events, he is documenting their end. Narrative warfare at arraignment is the last refuge of those who have exhausted every other form of power. Courts record it, translate it if necessary, and then proceed as if it were never said. The arrest and prosecution of a former head of state sends a signal that intelligence analysts must treat with precision rather than emotion. Legal capture is not merely a personal downfall, it is a structural message to elites, allies, and adversaries about how power now ends. I have watched governments underestimate this effect, assuming that courtroom proceedings are a footnote to geopolitics. They are not. They reshape behavior far beyond the individual in custody. From an intelligence standpoint, the first consequence is deterrence recalibration. Elites who once believed that political relevance guaranteed safety are forced to reconsider. The sight of a former leader invoking lost titles before a judge communicates that there is no safe off ramp once recognition and protection vanish. This alters succession planning, internal power struggles, and the willingness of subordinates to follow orders that may later be scrutinized. Intelligence services that fail to account for this shift miss emerging fractures within regimes and networks. The second consequence is alliance signaling. When a prosecution proceeds without diplomatic rescue, it reveals where loyalties actually lie. States that might have intervened choose silence. Consulates comply with procedure rather than defiance. This is intelligence gold, yet it is often overlooked because it lacks spectacle. The absence of support is more informative than any public statement. It tells you which relationships were transactional and which were illusions sustained by fear. The third consequence is narrative collapse. Once legal capture occurs, propaganda loses coherence. Claims of sovereignty ring hollow against routine court filings. Intelligence analysts should note how quickly messaging shifts from confidence to grievance, from authority to victimhood. This transition marks the point at which the individual is no longer a strategic actor, but a case study. Continuing to frame him as a geopolitical variable is analytical inertia. The analytical breakdown shows that legal capture compresses time, options disappear rapidly, negotiation gives way to procedure, influence gives way to counsel. For intelligence, this demands a shift from monitoring power projection to assessing legal outcomes and their ripple effects. Too often, agencies remain locked in the old frame, producing assessments about movements and loyalties that no longer matter. The hard lesson is stark. In the modern system, prison has replaced exile as the endpoint of failed power. Declaring yourself president does not slow that process. It accelerates recognition that it is complete. Intelligence that fails to adjust to this reality does not just misread events, it misleads decision makers about where power truly resides. The final lesson intelligence professionals must confront is the one institutions resist most. Power ends decisively, and it ends without ceremony. Declaring yourself president in a courtroom is not an assertion of authority. It is evidence that authority has already dissolved. I have watched intelligence systems cling to outdated frames because admitting this truth exposes earlier failures. It forces acknowledgement that warnings were missed, narratives indulged, and legal realities ignored until they became unavoidable. What ultimately collapses is not just an individual's claim to office, but the strategic narrative that sustained it. For years, analysts may describe a leader as indispensable, stabilizing, or immune. Those descriptors persist long after recognition has faded because they are easier than revising judgments. When arrest occurs, the shock is not operational, it is psychological. The system confronts the fact that it mistook longevity for legitimacy and rhetoric for protection. The intelligence distortion lies in confusing influence with immunity. Influence is situational and temporary. Immunity is conditional and revocable. Once revoked, it does not return because of protest or posture. Courts do not negotiate status, they process defendants. The analytical breakdown reveals that every stage of decline was observable. Assets were frozen, travel narrowed, allies hedged, legal filings accumulated. Each signal pointed to the same outcome. Intelligence that treated these as peripheral rather than central failed in its most basic task, forecasting. The strategic consequence extends beyond any single case. Elites around the world absorb the message. Some will entrench themselves further, delaying the inevitable at greater cost. Others will seek genuine exits while they still can. Intelligence services must adapt by integrating legal exposure into threat assessments, not as a moral judgment, but as an operational variable. The age of assuming that former leaders simply fade away is over. The hard lesson is not about justice or vengeance, it is about reality. Declaring yourself president does not protect you from prison because protection no longer comes from titles. It comes from recognition, control, and the willingness of other states to intervene. When those vanish, no amount of narrative can restore them. For intelligence professionals, the obligation is clear. Strip away the fiction early, or be forced to explain later why the outcome seemed surprising when it never was.